This is not a family disagreement. This is an institutional rupture unfolding in real time. According to sources with direct visibility inside royal legal channels, a private conflict surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle has crossed a threshold that Buckingham Palace quietly feared for months. Speaking from London within the past hour, insiders say the dispute is no longer centered on parenting preferences or personal grievances, but on jurisdiction, authority, and the long-term constitutional footprint of Archie and Lilibet Mountbatten Windsor. Public assumptions that the matter was emotional, temporary, containable are now reportedly being reassessed at the highest levels. What is unfolding, sources say, carries implications far beyond Montecito or Windsor. It touches succession optics, security obligations, and the Crown's control over royal lineage narratives. And according to those tracking the situation closely, a line has now been crossed, one that cannot easily be walked back. Sources say the confrontation did not erupt publicly, but behind closed doors, with a severity that reportedly stunned even senior palace intermediaries. What began as a series of routine discussions between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle regarding the future upbringing of Archie and Lilibet has, according to multiple accounts, hardened into a full-scale internal crisis, one now described by insiders as structural, not emotional. At the center of the shock is an alleged divergence that insiders claim has become irreconcilable. Prince Harry, reportedly drawing from his own childhood experience within royal constraint, is said to be pushing for defined institutional boundaries, clear decisions on titles, education pathways, and long-term security protocols tied to the United Kingdom. Meghan Markle, according to those familiar with the discussions, is believed to be advocating for a future anchored firmly outside royal frameworks, minimizing symbolic obligations while preserving selective status benefits. What has raised alarm within royal circles is not the disagreement itself, but its timing and escalation. Sources say the clash intensified just as internal reviews were underway concerning the long-term application of the 1917 letters patent and how they may, or may not, apply to future generations living permanently outside Britain. That coincidence, insiders suggest, triggered concern that private family decisions could soon collide with formal institutional policy. Adding to the tension, Windsor-based sources claim King Charles III has been kept informed through intermediaries, not direct communication, an arrangement that itself signals strain. One senior figure reportedly described the situation as a governance issue masquerading as a marital one. Behind palace walls, aides are said to be quietly assessing scenarios once considered unthinkable, competing public narratives about the children's identity, legal ambiguities over representation, and the reputational risk of appearing either punitive or permissive. The declaration now circulating internally is stark. This is no longer about compromise, it is about control, precedent, and who ultimately decides the future status of royal bloodlines. And according to those tracking the situation hour by hour, the next phase will not be emotional, it will be procedural, legal, and potentially irreversible. According to sources familiar with internal palace deliberations, the moment the dispute hardened, the response shifted decisively from mediation to mechanism. What had once been managed by senior aides and private counsel was, insiders say, quietly elevated into the domain of constitutional instruments, tools designed not for reconciliation but for containment. At the center of this escalation is the Privy Council, an institution rarely invoked publicly but frequently referenced when the monarchy perceives long-term structural risk. Sources allege that briefing papers were circulated outlining how existing frameworks, particularly the letters patent of 1917 and subsequent amendments, could be interpreted, revised, or clarified to define the status, privileges, and symbolic positioning of royal descendants raised outside the United Kingdom. Crucially, insiders stress that no formal action has yet been taken, but the preparation alone has reportedly sent a clear signal. The institution is willing to assert authority if private decisions threaten public coherence. One legal advisor, speaking anonymously, described the move as placing the tools on the table without yet picking one up. Equally significant is the alleged review of security entitlements. Under current arrangements, protection decisions intersect with Home Office policy, royal status, and residency. Sources claim palace lawyers have been asked to map scenarios in which future security obligations could be limited, redefined, or entirely decoupled from lineage, particularly if public representation diverges from institutional alignment. What makes this phase especially volatile is its quiet nature. There are no statements, no briefings, no denials. Everything, sources say, is being handled through memos, precedents, and contingency planning. And that silence, insiders warn, is deliberate. Once mechanisms are activated, reversals become politically and legally complex. Behind the scenes, Prince William is reportedly being kept informed through constitutional advisors rather than family channels, reinforcing the perception that this is now a matter of state continuity rather than sibling dispute. One source described it bluntly: this is about safeguarding the system from ambiguity. But as these institutional weapons are quietly unsheathed, another concern is beginning to dominate internal conversations. Because legal authority only becomes necessary, sources note, when trust has already fractured. And according to several insiders, what emerges next is not policy, but proof that something fundamental may have already been violated. What has most unsettled palace officials, according to multiple sources, is not the disagreement itself, but a growing body of material that reportedly reframes it. Internal discussions, insiders say, have begun to center on whether certain private actions taken quietly over the past year may have crossed from personal choice into institutional breach. Sources allege that documents, correspondence, and third party agreements are now being reviewed to determine whether representations were made, implicitly or explicitly, about the future public role of Archie and Lilibet without consultation or authorization. While no single action is described as explosive on its own, officials reportedly view the pattern as destabilizing, suggesting parallel decision making outside accepted royal protocols. One area of concern, insiders say, involves branding and symbolic usage. Legal advisors are allegedly examining whether titles, styles, or royal identifiers were referenced in discussions with educational, media, or philanthropic entities in ways that implied institutional backing. Even the appearance of such implication, sources warn, could create precedents the monarchy has historically moved quickly to shut down. Financial structures have also entered the frame. According to those briefed on the matter, palace accountants have been asked to trace indirect flows, trust arrangements, advisory retainers, and future-facing contracts to assess whether expectations tied to royal lineage were factored into negotiations. Again, insiders stress no wrongdoing has been formally alleged, but the very need for review signals that confidence has eroded. What elevates this from concern to crisis is the allegation that some of these actions may have occurred while parallel assurances were being given to senior figures that no such steps were underway. If substantiated, sources say that discrepancy would not merely be seen as a misunderstanding, but as a breach of internal trust. By late evening, according to one account, an urgent briefing note was circulated describing the situation as time sensitive. The language, insiders say, was unusually direct, warning that unresolved ambiguity could harden into irreversible narrative damage if external disclosure occurred first. The implication is stark. If this material moves beyond internal review, the palace may be forced to act not out of choice, but out of necessity. And according to those monitoring the clock, that decision point may be approaching faster than anyone expected. By the early hours of the morning, sources say the tone inside royal legal circles had shifted again, this time from investigation to urgency. What had been treated as a sensitive internal review was now, according to insiders, bound by an unspoken clock. Not a public deadline, but a procedural one, dictated by exposure risk and institutional reflex. Several palace-connected figures described the same concern emerging independently across departments. If decisions were not formalized internally, external forces, media disclosures, contractual triggers, or third-party confirmations could seize control of the narrative. One advisor reportedly summarized it as decide quietly now or explain loudly later. At the heart of the pressure is timing. Sources allege that certain agreements tied to future planning, educational placements, residency declarations, or long term security assumptions carry activation windows. Once crossed, these would allegedly require public acknowledgement, filings, or indirect confirmations that could lock in interpretations before the Crown has positioned itself. Adding to the urgency is the calendar of the monarchy itself. With upcoming institutional milestones, state events, charitable reviews, and succession adjacent optics, insiders warn that unresolved ambiguity surrounding the children's status could bleed into formal appearances and briefing materials. That risk, sources say, is unacceptable at a moment when the monarchy is attempting to project stability and cohesion. Privately, according to those briefed, a narrow window has been identified. Within it, options remain flexible. Clarifications can be issued, understandings reaffirmed, and private assurances restored. Outside it, responses become reactive, shaped by precedent rather than strategy. It is here that the conflict reportedly pivots, because time pressure has a way of stripping diplomacy of its softness. According to insiders, Prince Harry has been made aware, indirectly, that patience is thinning. The message, while never written, is said to be unmistakable. Prolonged uncertainty will invite institutional intervention. Yet the most delicate aspect of the deadline is not legal, it is personal. Sources say that any decisive move risks redefining not just policy, but legacy, how future generations interpret who stood where when the moment demanded clarity. As the window narrows, attention is reportedly turning away from documents and toward bloodlines, inheritance, and the symbolic weight of what is passed down. Because when time runs out, choices stop being theoretical. As the deadline tightens, sources say the conversation inside the royal household has shifted from strategy to inheritance, less about what can be done and more about what will endure. Because beneath the legal language and procedural urgency lies a question the monarchy has faced for centuries: how legacy is preserved when blood and institution pull in opposite directions. According to insiders, King Charles III is now confronting the dilemma not as a father but as a custodian. The issue, sources say, is not whether Archie and Lilibet are loved or protected, but how their identities are framed within the historical continuum of the crown. Decisions taken now, advisors warn, will echo across reigns, shaping how future monarchs interpret authority, distance, and obligation. Privately, comparisons are reportedly being drawn to earlier moments of rupture, abdications, exiles, and negotiated separations that left scars precisely because they were handled inconsistently. One senior aide allegedly remarked that ambiguity is the most dangerous inheritance of all. In other words, leaving matters unresolved may feel compassionate in the present, but corrosive in the long term. Prince William's role, sources say, has become pivotal, not as a brother, but as a future king evaluating risk. Advisors around him are reportedly focused on symbolic vaults, titles, styles, patronages that function like institutional heirlooms. Once unlocked or diluted, they cannot easily be restored. The fear, insiders suggest, is not loss, but precedent. At the family level, this creates an emotional fracture. Sources claim Prince Harry views the debate through the lens of protection and autonomy, determined to spare his children the pressures he endured. Yet from the institutional side, that same instinct is interpreted as unilateral withdrawal from a system that still confers status, recognition, and historical weight. What makes the dilemma acute is that both positions can claim moral ground, and when morality collides with monarchy, compromise becomes elusive. According to those close to the process, the conclusion now forming is uncomfortable but clear. Preserving legacy may require action that feels, in human terms, cold. As that realization settles in, focus is reportedly shifting once again from reflection to response, because when legacy is threatened, institutions do not wait for consensus, they move. With consensus slipping out of reach, sources say the palace has begun to think in terms of insulation rather than reconciliation. The strategy now taking shape, insiders allege, is not designed to punish, but to protect the core architecture of the monarchy from unpredictable exposure. At the center of these countermoves is narrative control. According to officials familiar with communications planning, contingency drafts are being prepared that would allow the institution to clarify boundaries without directly referencing personal conflict. Carefully calibrated language, sources say, could reaffirm longstanding principles, residency, service, representation, while avoiding any overt attribution of blame. Simultaneously, legal advisors are reportedly mapping phased responses. Instead of a single decisive act, the approach under discussion would unfold in layers, quiet administrative adjustments followed by policy clarifications, and only then, if necessary, formal declarations. The intent, insiders explain, is to reduce shock while steadily reasserting institutional coherence. Prince William's influence in this phase is described as deliberate and unsentimental. Sources claim he has emphasized the need to future proof decisions, even if they invite short term controversy. In internal discussions, he is said to have framed the issue as one of risk management, arguing that unclear lines today become crises tomorrow. Another countermove involves distance. Insiders allege that channels of communication are being narrowed with fewer intermediaries and tighter information loops. The logic, sources say, is straightforward. The fewer variables involved, the lower the risk of misinterpretation or leakage. Yet perhaps the most consequential move under consideration is financial recalibration. According to those briefed, resource flows, security support, logistical facilitation, and access to royal infrastructure are being reviewed not as entitlements but as conditional supports. This reframing, insiders suggest, marks a psychological shift as much as a practical one. All of this, sources stress, is being done quietly, almost clinically. There are no raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, just a steady repositioning that signals resolve. And as these strategic pieces slide into place, attention is turning to their inevitable pressure point: money, sustainability, and the cost of standing apart from the institution that once absorbed those burdens. Because strategy only becomes real when resources are tested. As strategic lines harden, sources say the abstract debate has begun to translate into tangible pressure. Because once institutional support is reclassified as conditional, the financial mathematics of independence become unavoidable. According to insiders, detailed cost assessments are now circulating, figures that attach real numbers to security, legal counsel, travel coordination, and long term risk mitigation. These are not symbolic expenses. They are sustained, escalating obligations that, within the royal system, were historically absorbed quietly by the institution itself. One advisor familiar with the reviews described the moment as when ideology meets invoices. In other words, principles can be defended in theory, but they must survive in practice. And the numbers, sources say, are sobering. Security alone looms large. Without automatic alignment to royal protocols, protection becomes a private matter, complex, high risk, and extremely costly. Insiders note that long term arrangements require constant reassessment, specialist teams, and insurance structures that few private households, however affluent, maintain indefinitely without strain. There are also questions around contractual sustainability. Sources allege that existing agreements, media, advisory, philanthropic, were structured with certain assumptions about visibility, status, and continuity. If those assumptions shift, renegotiations may follow. And renegotiations, insiders warn, rarely favor the party operating under pressure. Compounding the threat is liquidity versus longevity. Assets may exist on paper, but sustained independence demands predictable cash flow. Mortgage obligations, staffing, and future educational costs for two children represent commitments that cannot be paused during moments of uncertainty. According to those close to the situation, this financial recalibration is not being framed as a warning, but as a reality check. No ultimatums are being issued, no deadlines announced. The pressure is structural, not verbal. And it is precisely this quiet arithmetic strain that insiders believe is most destabilizing, because it erodes certainty without offering a clear adversary. As resources tighten and assumptions fall away, the conflict shifts inward. Sources say the psychological toll is now emerging: stress, isolation, and the corrosive effect of feeling simultaneously exposed and unsupported. And that is when decision making becomes most vulnerable. According to those monitoring the situation closely, the conflict has now entered its most volatile phase, not legal, not financial, but psychological. Because when institutional backing recedes and future outcomes remain unresolved, the strain stops being abstract and starts becoming deeply personal. Sources describe an atmosphere of compression around Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, where every decision is weighed against potential consequence and every silence is interpreted as intent. The sense, insiders say, is not of open confrontation but of encirclement, an awareness that options are narrowing even as public visibility remains high. Privately, advisors are said to worry about decision fatigue, the constant recalibration, what to say, what not to say, what to commit to, what to delay, creates a condition in which missteps become more likely. One source characterized it as operating under floodlights with the rulebook changing mid-game. Isolation compounds the pressure. Without trusted institutional buffers, sources allege that information now arrives fragmented, filtered, and often late. That lag, insiders warn, fuels suspicion. Are decisions already being made elsewhere? Are lines already drawn? In such environments, uncertainty becomes corrosive. There is also the weight of parental responsibility. According to those familiar with the emotional landscape, Archie and Lilibet are no longer abstract symbols in this debate. They are immediate considerations shaping every calculation. Choices once framed as principled stands now carry perceived risks that feel irreversible. Inside palace circles, this psychological strain is not dismissed. In fact, some advisors reportedly view it as the decisive factor, because under sustained pressure, individuals do not always choose the most strategic path. They choose the one that feels most survivable. That is why insiders say the institution is watching closely, not to provoke, but to anticipate, because moments of psychological siege are when unexpected concessions, disclosures, or public statements emerge, sometimes unintentionally. As this pressure builds, the final question comes into focus, not what the crown can enforce, but what outcome will be judged by history, by the public, and by the family itself as justified. And with that judgment looming, the moment approaches when restraint gives way to resolution. What emerges from this unfolding confrontation, sources say, is not a verdict, but a reckoning, because at its core, this crisis is less about titles or treaties than about how power, responsibility, and family intersect when no option remains painless. From an institutional perspective, the monarchy is doing what it has always done when faced with ambiguity: closing ranks, clarifying boundaries, and prioritizing continuity over comfort. History suggests this instinct is not personal but systemic. Crowns endure by reducing uncertainty, even when the human cost is quietly acknowledged behind palace walls. From a personal vantage point, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stand at a crossroads defined by consequence rather than intention. Every path forward carries trade offs: visibility versus protection, autonomy versus stability, principle versus precedent. Sources stress that none of these choices are simple and none are free of moral weight. The deeper lesson, insiders argue, lies in the collision itself. Institutions move slowly but decisively. Individuals move emotionally but unpredictably. When the two collide, compromise is rarely clean and someone always bears the strain. For the public, this moment offers a rare window into how modern power structures respond under pressure. Not with spectacle, but with process. Not with declarations, but with recalibration. What happens next may never be fully disclosed, yet its outcomes will surface gradually through absences, adjustments, and subtle shifts in language. And that is why this story matters, because it is still unfolding. If you want to stay informed as these developments evolve, if you want to understand not just what happens, but why, now is the moment to stay engaged, follow closely, question narratives, and pay attention to what is said quietly, not just what is announced loudly, because in institutions built on tradition, the most consequential